Good afternoon. I'm Dan Rosenzweig, the President and CEO of Habitat for Humanity of Greater Charlottesville. I'm also honored to serve as the co-chair of Habitat for Humanity International's Cost of Home Public Policy and Solutions Task Force. On behalf of everyone at Habitat, I want to wish everybody a great afternoon and thank you so much for joining our discussion. Today, we're here to talk about advocating for home affordability. Families and individuals all over the United States are paying too high a price to cover the cost of home. Everywhere you look, cities, suburbs, rural areas, the stability that home should bring remains out of reach for far too many families. Launched in 2019, Habitat's Cost of Home campaign is a comprehensive 5-year national effort to mobilize local Habitat organizations, our partners, our volunteers, and community members to join together to find solutions and enact policies that will allow 10 million individuals to meet their most basic needs. Through the campaign, Habitat's already been part of helping more than 4 million people in the U.S. gain improved access to stable, affordable housing. So to kick us off today, we're first going to hear from Kristen Vinagro with the Richmond affiliate in Richmond, Virginia, about the role that they played in helping to bring about a source of income protection for folks in the Commonwealth.
In early 2020, Richmond Habitat joined forces with housing organizations from across the state to advocate at the Virginia General Assembly in support of legislation that would eliminate the ability to discriminate against potential tenants based on their source of income. So basically, this means that individuals in the state of Virginia who have housing vouchers now have increased opportunity when it comes to where they can live. We worked towards this goal by partnering with the Virginia Housing Alliance. They are the main nonprofit housing advocacy group in the state of Virginia, and each year they plan a housing day at the Virginia General Assembly where housing advocates from across the state come together to talk to legislators about important legislation and issues that are going to help to further their work. The Cost of Home campaign provided a tremendous value to our work in helping to pass this legislation. It really empowered us to feel more comfortable talking to legislators about the importance of equitable access to affordable housing for individuals across the country and in the state of Virginia. Since that legislative win, Habitat affiliates in Virginia now meet on a weekly basis to talk about advocacy opportunities, how we can become more involved in the Cost of Home campaign, and to use our collective voices to make real change when it comes to housing policy.
Great. Well, I'm hoping that people could hear that. My audio wasn't working there, so I'll ask the other panelists to shake. Okay, great. Okay. So that was great work by our friends in Richmond. Source of income protection is key to pushing back against a century of housing policy that's too often resulted in segregated communities and in barriers to access to neighborhoods of opportunity. So Richmond's work should inspire us all as we work to keep the momentum going despite the headwinds of the past year. So we all know that before the COVID-19 pandemic, more than 17 million US households were already spending half or more of their income on housing. And COVID's only deepened the crisis. And it's demonstrated what we all know, those of us who work in housing know, that too many people, too often just find themselves just one paycheck or one healthcare bill away from losing their home. So as Habitat's Cost of Home campaign closes out its second year, we continue to grapple with the question of which policy solutions will be most impactful, what's going to really move the needle, and that is the focus of today's conversation. We are so fortunate to have 3 distinguished panelists joining us to kick off the conversation about key steps we can take to build on the campaign's first 2 years. Senator Ana Caballero is a member of the California State Senate and represents the 12th Senate District. The senator serves on the California State Senate Housing Committee and has played an active role in forging a policy partnership with Habitat in California. Welcome, Senator Caballero.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all the excellent work that you do.
Next is Henry Cisneros, the former Secretary of HUD. He's also the founder and chairman of CityView, which is a partner in developing more than 100 communities in 13 states, constructing more than 7,000 homes along the way. We are exceptionally grateful for Secretary Cisneros for joining us today, but also for his lifetime of work and, of course, for serving on the Cost of Home campaign cabinet. Thanks so much, Mr. Secretary, for all you continue to do to make housing a basic human right.
Glad to be with you. I'm a big fan of Habitat. A lot of lives have been touched.
And last but not least, we're joined by Tony Pickett, CEO of Grounded Solutions Network, a national nonprofit organization with more than 200 members. Working together with local community leaders, Grounded Solutions advances its mission to cultivate communities by implementing affordable housing solutions that last for generations. And I have to say, Grounded Solutions was one of our first organizational endorsers for the campaign and a key partner. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you, Dan, and I'm honored to count many Habitat affiliates across the country as part of our over 200 member network. So it's no secret that our organizations actually originated in the late 1960s in South Georgia, within a stone's throw of each other. So it's natural that we're partners in this work.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I want to say to everybody who's watching and participating from home that after the panel discussion, the group's going to be taking questions directly from the audience. So for everyone joining us remotely, please feel free to drop comments in the chat or questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. But before that, I want to start the panel discussion at a relatively high altitude. So I want to ask our panelists, from each of your perspectives, what are the top 2 or maybe 3 opportunities today for policy solutions that address the increasing cost of housing across the rental and homeownership spectrum? Secretary Cisneros, would you like to start us off?
Dan, I'd be happy to. Let me begin, if I may, for just a brief diversion to thank all of you on this panel. Dan, your work with Charlottesville Habitat, very important on the ground. A really rooted experience, and Tony Pickett with Grounded Solutions, doing work all across the country, building communities in the holistic way that we must. But I want to say a special thank you and greeting to Senator Caballero, who I have known since she was a city council person in Salinas and then became mayor, and then went to the state assembly in California. And then Governor Brown very wisely selected her to be a member of his cabinet and run the agency that includes business affairs, but housing, very importantly. It's one of the most important cabinet assignments in California, and now, of course, is in the state Senate, but a lifetime of very substantial public service. Let me go directly to your question. I think we're blessed to be in a moment when those of us who've been working in housing and know that we've always had gaps, shortfalls in housing funding, maybe looking at a moment when it is possible to really broaden our aperture and identify more sources of funding for critical housing. And I say this to this audience, which is made up of Habitat activists and advocates, because we have before us cities receiving funding through the American Rescue Plan, which is the first initiative that came out last March related to the pandemic, $1.9 trillion. And many municipalities have cash on hand that can be used discretionarily for the most significant shortfalls related to the pandemic, and that includes housing. So Habitat advocates should step up and connect with their municipalities. Many of them are looking for the most effective thing to do with that housing rescue, with that American Rescue Plan money. Just ahead of us is the infrastructure plan that President Biden has proposed, which is being called the American Jobs Plan. And as you read in the press, it ranges from roughly $1 trillion initiative to a $2.2 trillion initiative, but it's going to be a substantial amount of money. And the best news is that most of the iterations of this plan regard housing as part of infrastructure. So yes, infrastructure is airports and roads and water systems and power systems and ports. But for the first time in a very long time, we're talking about housing, public housing, and assistance for housing, subsidies for housing, et cetera, as part of that effort. In addition, the president's budget that just came out highlights funding for housing in some special ways. So that, I would say, to me, makes this a special moment to deal with the priorities, the affordability of housing generally. I think we're all afraid that when we regard the pandemic as indeed over, and that means lifting restrictions on moratoria related to rent payments, and on evictions, that we're going to find a lot of people on the streets. I worry that that's going to include families with children, and I worry that that's going to include a lot of elderly Americans. So this is a time when we need to really think, how does Habitat link its housing initiatives to those critical priorities? And then finally, I would say, I think we have to always be concerned about those Americans who are the most unhoused, and that's the homeless. That number had been functioning for a decade or so around 800,000 people a night in shelters. It dropped for a short while there, a couple of years, to about 600,000. But with the pandemic and the after effects of the pandemic, I expect that's going to increase again. And we're going to see some very, very sad cases, dangerous situations with people, vulnerabilities to sickness on the streets. It's just not acceptable in our country that we accept that level of homelessness. And though it has not been a frontline capability of Habitat to deal with homelessness, Habitat does provide housing along the spectrum, and to the degree that we can get homeless people into Habitat housing, to me, that would be a huge contribution out of this pandemic. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary. Yeah, you bring up some great points, in particular that the Habitat is most clearly identified with home ownership, and that really is sort of our core program. But our vision has never been a world of home ownership. It's been a world where everyone can find access to a simple, decent, affordable place to live. And that's what the Cost of Home campaign is really doing. It's expanding our work so that we can bolster a healthy housing ecosystem where everyone can find a decent place to live. So thank you very much. Tony, do you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, I just want to echo what Henry has brought up about this opportunity, especially in terms of federal policy, and really focusing for the first time in a way on housing that I have not seen previously. I think the pandemic really made it apparent to all of us across the country that we are all at risk. Employment could end due to situations beyond our control, and all of a sudden we're at risk of being homeless ourselves. So I just want to applaud him for really making that point. But I also want to dive a little more deeply and really highlight the fact that as part of this federal policy moment, our organization has partnered with Habitat and several other strategic partners, including the Center for Community Progress, to introduce a bill in the House called the Restoring Communities Left Behind Act. And that's at the U.S. House now. A companion is about to be introduced in the Senate. And what that bill focuses on are places that were already struggling before the pandemic, places like Cleveland, Buffalo, St. Louis, Baltimore, really making new federal resources available to those places for housing, and agnostic about whether the housing is rental or homeownership. Our organization, like Habitat, focuses on homeownership as sort of the core piece of our business, really making sure that people have access to it for wealth creation. And this approach is really part of the solution, we feel, to solving the racial wealth gap. And that is, I think, one of the urgent matters that was already a crisis before the pandemic and has been further created as a divide between Americans of color and others across this country. And that act that we've introduced would provide $5 billion a year for the next 10 years. And it is flexible funding that could be used for things that we advocate for, like community land trusts to protect the affordability of housing in perpetuity. If we're going to invest public dollars into creating an affordable homeownership unit as a resource, why not keep that home affordable over time? And again, that is balancing wealth creation for the family. Most of the folks who buy our permanently affordable homes through community land trusts have been shown within a 5 to 7 year period to actually be able to transition to traditional market rate homeownership, that economic mobility that we need to couple along with providing much needed housing resources. And so really the thrust of that bill, again, as I said, was to provide flexible funding, and it can do things like allow us to partner in different ways with local and regional organizations, create land banks that could actually create larger housing portfolios and give us more access to land for housing uses. So again, I urge anyone who is listening, if you've not done your homework on the Restoring Communities Left Behind Act, please Google it, reach out to your representatives in Congress, both in the House and the Senate, and advocate for that today.
Thank you so much. We'll go back and revisit that act a little bit later in the program, but I know Senator Caballero has to leave us in about 10 minutes or so, so I want to give her an opportunity to talk about the most impactful initiatives that she's working on, either in California or things that she sees nationally. Senator?
Thank you very much for that question. In California, our issue is the lack of housing, period. We're between 2.5 million to 3.5 million housing units short, kind of as we sit here today. And at the rate that we're building, we'll never catch up. And so part of the challenge is that the development of housing in California continues to be single family homes located on the outskirts of community, leading to sprawl and some of the environmental issues related to people having to travel so far to get to work, and the need for the single-use vehicle to be able to travel. And so what I focused on, the Senate is working on a package of bills, and the package deals with a number of issues that we find in our community, the need to increase densities, the need to have a bond to be able to create resources to be able to build affordable housing, the additional use of ADUs or accessory dwelling units as a affordable housing tool. Also the ability to upzone close to job centers and utilize a public transportation system and reduce parking. But my favorite bill, of course, is my own, which is SB 6. And that really is to look at the change in purchasing patterns in our society. What we've seen is more and more people are buying their goods online, and the pandemic has expedited that, so that you see a number of the major chains are downsizing or going out of business completely, leaving fairly large commercial retail space that's available for repurposing. And so my bill would create an opportunity to expedite the redevelopment of those commercial sites into townhouses, condos, and apartments, so that we can increase densities along these major transportation routes. A recent report that was prepared, a study on the property in California, estimated that we could create 2 million housing units in the state of California if we pass this bill, and also include it, and that it can be done with a skilled and trained workforce, which means union labor and affordable housing element. And so I'm real excited about the possibility of being able to take property that has already been developed in our urban cores. And frankly, my district is a rural agricultural district in California. And the stores that are the ones that are likely to close first are in rural California, because we just don't have the population density. So we have a significant inventory of commercial property that we believe is going to be accessible if we can get this passed. And we're taking a fairly large portion of our state budget and putting it into housing, because we recognize that this is a snapshot, building on what the secretary had to say about federal dollars. Is if we match federal dollars with state dollars, we believe that we can accomplish some really important goals in the next few years.
Thank you so much. And I have to say that the blowing up chat with some of your friends in California, you're very much appreciated for championing affordable home ownership and housing in California. So we've got a comment from the state support organization that thanks you and your team for your leadership championing affordable home ownership, and another one from the San Diego Habitat who says, we're grateful for your support of home ownership in California. Thank you for being a champion of Habitat. And I know you need to leave in a few minutes, but as we all know, the housing challenge in our country is not just quantitative. It's not just the shortage of units, but there's a qualitative component as well. So we know that families have suffered for generations from the legacy of redlining, restrictive covenants, and other policies and practices that have created and reinforced racial inequality in housing. Senator Caballero, before you leave, I'm wondering if you could share some of your ideas for how we can redress structural and intentional housing and economic inequity.
Well, that's probably the biggest challenge of our day right now, is to figure out how do we go back. I was just reading an article in the Fresno Bee, as a matter of fact, that talked about the historical nature of the covenants that were put on properties beginning in the late 1800s all the way into the 1960s. And so you have neighborhoods that have been redlined and that have excluded members of the community for a really long time. The interesting thing about this article is it was the genesis was the against the Armenian community, and it had to do with the Armenian immigrants coming in and being very successful in championing each other that set up this system of redlining every ethnic group that came in after that. And so the challenge becomes, how do we create an opportunity for people to be able to move into other neighborhoods, or to be able to desegregate neighborhoods? Frankly, from my perspective, one of that is a first-time home buyers program. We need to get the cash into the hands of individuals that traditionally have been excluded from home ownership opportunities, and create opportunities for them to move into neighborhoods that they wouldn't have been able to move into before. California currently has the lowest home ownership since the 1940s. And what that tells me is that all of the benefits of the GI Bill have been lost. And the GI Bill was tremendously important for people of color to be able to buy their first home. Well, that's been lost because of our inability to build enough housing and to be able to include communities of color in the benefits of home ownership. There is nothing like giving a key to a home to someone who's been excluded from the market, and to see what an impact it has on their family is tremendously moving. And so we're looking at, I think that's one of the keys is to create the opportunity to build mixed income type of units within those communities, and everybody's got to do it. It's state law, but now we've got to enforce it, and then to create first-time home buyers opportunity for people to actually be able to move in and own something.
Thank you so much, Senator. Well, I know that you'll need to leave in a couple of minutes so you can go get this whole budget thing sorted out in the state of California. So thanks again for joining us. But I do want to turn it over to Tony, because I know that that housing equity is very central to your work. Wondering if you can talk a little bit about what Grounded Solutions is focusing on.
Sure. And one thing I want to say is what was just talked about in terms of the historic context. We know that we're dealing with institutional and structural racism. That's what it is. That's what it's been. And it's really been designed to limit the opportunities for Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian families in this country, and along with others, for generations. And so I think really what we're talking about, at least from our perspective, is a shift at the federal level, really a radical reimagination of what does federal policy that is fair and equitable and actually uses a racial equity lens to prioritize resources to help lift up those families who have suffered from this historic injustice that we've perpetrated upon them. And so one of the things I just want to highlight is, again, we're working in partnership with a whole range of folks around focusing on affirmatively furthering fair housing. The National Fair Housing Alliance is leading the charge. They're doing a great job over there, but we're all supporting in saying that we really need to see some kind of federal requirement for a concrete commitment to fair housing. And just as we were just learning, no matter where you are in this country, there are exclusionary housing policies and practices at play that really require some intentional work to address them. And so if right now I'm aware that HUD is working to create a new set of rules around AFFH, as it's called, and really trying to move the needle in terms of providing incentive and support for local jurisdictions who want to do a better job of providing housing opportunity across a variety of environments in those high opportunity neighborhoods, as well as those traditionally disinvested neighborhoods. So I also encourage folks to really look into and follow the conversation and the debate that is going on around affirmatively furthering fair housing as one of the best means to address this long-standing institutional and structural racism.
Thank you, Tony. And the Secretary Cisneros, you talked earlier about this being kind of a golden moment for really aggressively getting after some of the structural challenges that face us as a country in terms of housing. Probably none more important than AFFH. And as we know, it's sort of waxed and waned throughout different administrations since the Civil Rights Act, including your time as HUD Secretary. How would you comment on the opportunities right now for us to seriously begin to affirmatively further fair housing?
Well, I think Tony's assessment is entirely correct, and that is that too often in our country's history, we have pursued policy paths that had buried in them a thread of racism. That's the only way to say it. And it destroyed communities and destroyed families and destroyed lives in the process. I was just looking the other day at a listing of federal policies that go back as far as FHA in the years after World War II, which specifically weighed whether or not FHA loans would be available in a neighborhood based upon the percentage distribution of African Americans. And it actually had percentage suggestions as to what would be the tipping point where a neighborhood should not be invested in, because after that it was likely to become more African American as whites left and more African Americans came. And they were put off limits, if you will, for FHA investment. There was a head of a major expert at FHA who actually had a categorization by ethnicity of what were desirable populations and what were most undesirable, with African Americans second to the last and Mexicans at the very last of that line. So it's been an incredible thing. The Federal Highway Administration and the way we made it possible for people to leave the cities and move to the suburbs, but not on a fair basis. Only some could make that trek because only some could get the loans and some would be redlined. And I know this sounds really difficult to hear to ears that are not accustomed to kind of facing this question, but unfortunately it is real. It is what has created a lot of the problems we confront for communities, but also for families and for individuals that never got a fair chance at the American dream. The dream that says housing is a platform for all of the other aspirations we have: education, jobs, training. Housing is a platform. Therefore, access to housing is part of arriving at the platform from which you can launch into those ambitions. And we also know that housing is more than a platform. It's also the largest investment for most Americans. and it leads to net worth. For most Americans, the sum of their net worth is the equity they have in their home. The white home ownership rate is 72%. The African American home ownership rate is 42%. The Latino home ownership rate is 48%. Now, if we regard as housing as the entryway to net worth, then we're saying to people you can never achieve. I saw an estimate the other day that even if the white home ownership were held constant, it's about a 200-year quest to try to get African Americans to the same level of home ownership. So again, I say to my dear friends at Habitat, people who care deeply about our country and contribute their efforts and their money to Habitat, we just can't avoid the reality that the game is not fair. And I saw it with my own eyes as Secretary of HUD. We commissioned the Urban Institute to do tests, fair, well-constructed tests, and one of them was described to me as follows. An advertisement is placed in the paper for a rental property, and a young man who's African American and well-educated and has an income goes in search of that rental property in the suburbs of an American city, and the landlord says, "Oh, I know you saw that advertisement, but I want to tell you, we just leased the last unit. I'm sorry, you're a little late, and come back another time and maybe we'll have another opening, but that one's gone." A white person of the same age, same background educationally, and same income level comes 2 hours later, stands before that landlord, and the landlord says, "Sure, let me get the keys so I can show you the apartment." That's unfortunately the reality. And economists would have us believe that if you enact this policy and this policy and this policy, then housing policy will work, assuming that everything else is equal. The only problem is that's an assumption that is not real. Everything else is not equal. It's not fair. And as a result, generations of people have been hurt, families have been damaged, children's opportunities have been stunted, and we've got to fix that. And Habitat has a role in this. Perhaps it has not been, sort of upfront the stated goal of Habitat, but if you're in the housing field, you've got to be attentive to these questions, or you're not maximizing the potential for solutions.
Amen. I think what you're talking about is really we need within this national reckoning on race, we need a little bit more humility universally to recognize that the structural advantages that some people have over others. This is following the thread of the 2017 march of white supremacists and Nazis on my fair town, Charlottesville. There was consensus formed that housing was the way we were going to address equity. That came in conflict with some of the things that people really hold dear here, which is neighborhood and historic preservation. And right now there's a bubbling up controversy around a proposed future land use map that intentionally seeks to redress the wrongs. So 70% of our land mass in Charlottesville is R1. Almost all of those R1 lots were underpinned by a racial restrictive covenant. Mm-hmm. I was at a neighborhood association meeting the other day, and a lot of people were up in arms about the potential changes to our zoning, essentially a citywide upzone, in particular in the historically exclusive neighborhoods. And all I could say was, look, I love this neighborhood. My kids run around barefoot here. I have plenty of parking. I've got plenty of open space. I love to garden. But the day that I purchased my house, the lawyer put in front of me a deed, now invalidated, that showed that my house was originally sold to whites only. And I would not be in that neighborhood had my father, who purchased a home with a loan that was backed by FHA in a Levittown, not been taken advantage or not been able to take advantage of loans that were available to whites only. Mm-hmm. He stored up equity, he saved over the years. He had enough money to make me a bridge loan so that I could move into my neighborhood. So my point to everybody watching today, throughout the Habitat network is get involved in local land use. Draw the connection between patterns of housing that exist now and intentional policy to give us exactly the outcome that people chose. I want to move on now because I want to introduce a clip from another partner with Habitat to talk about. Again, this follows up on the Secretary's comments about with money flowing into municipalities because of and states because of the American Rescue Act. I want to share a clip from a partner, Stockton Williams, the Executive Director of the National Council for State Housing Agencies, where he's talking about Habitat's role in supporting the success of the Homeowner Assistance Fund, which was included in the American Rescue Plan.
In the spring of 2020, Habitat for Humanity, the National Council of State Housing Agencies, the National Association of Realtors, the Mortgage Bankers Associations, and other housing groups quickly realized that while much attention was focused on the emerging housing crisis facing low-income renters, there were also millions of low-income homeowners who, because they had lost their jobs and were in difficult economic circumstances, could be looking at serious mortgage delinquency and even foreclosure. And so our organizations worked very closely in the spring of 2020 and throughout last summer with leading members of Congress to come up with a resource that would be there for those homeowners who needed help after forbearance and other temporary relief periods expired. Some of the most active champions of the Homeowner Assistance Fund legislation, people like Senator Brown from Ohio, Senator Reed from Rhode Island, heard directly and often from Habitat affiliates, as well as Habitat's Washington, D.C. staff, about the need for a homeowner assistance fund, the benefits that it would deliver in the states, and the importance for Congress to act immediately to provide a resource for low-income homeowners as part of COVID recovery. The Homeowner Assistance Fund is live. It is running at the federal level through the U.S. Treasury Department. Each state will receive an allocation of funding based on their levels of housing distress and other economic need. And over the next several months, programs will start to open up and become available to homeowners who need additional help. And this is a great opportunity for Habitat affiliates to help now inform the design of states' plans for the optimal ways to use this precious resource. And then when programs do open and the Homeowner Assistance Fund is actually delivering resources to needy homeowners, to make sure that in parts of the state and for populations that are particularly in vulnerable position, this program can do all the good that we feel very optimistic it will. It couldn't have happened without Habitat, and it won't happen as well without Habitat's continued involvement.
Great. I'm wondering if either Tony or Secretary Cisneros would like to comment on the success of the HAF.
Dan, we were not able to hear, or at least I was not able to hear one single word Stockton. So I'd have to be completely making it to comment on his remarks.
Well, I promised you softball questions, and look what I threw at you. Well, I could just say that policy successes such as the Homeowner Assistance Fund, as well as numerous state and local advances that were exemplified by the work of the Richmond Habitat, have provided much needed stability and affordability for families across the U.S. But we all know that the cost of home remains way too high for millions of families. So in our last quarter of an hour together, I'm going to invite the two of you to think bigger. And I'm going to ask each of you to look through a crystal ball, say 10 years forward from into the year 2031. And at that time, you're looking at a more balanced housing system where all types of housing is available to all types of people in all sorts of places. I want to know, what are the things we had done well? What are the key large initiatives that we as a country will have successfully undertaken to get us to that place? Tony, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for asking, Dan. And it ties to a goal, a vision that I announced to our members late last year to really move our portion of the housing sector, the shared equity sector, subsector within it, to a place of scale, moving from today, the shared equity contribution to affordable housing is about 255,000 units total across the country. And I said to our members, over the next 10 years, we need to move that number and add 1 million new units with lasting affordability for the reasons that I talked about earlier. And I know, just to give a little context, that Habitat in 2017 released a shelter report that really outlined the function and the effectiveness of shared equity housing programs at that time. And again, I want to do that because investing those dollars in shared equity homes has benefits for multiple families with the same housing unit. And so being able to leverage that kind of investment is a gain overall for everyone involved, the public sector, the family, the private sector, the nonprofit sector as well. And another aspect of that, I had a variety of strategies. Federal policy advocacy was certainly one of them, making sure that we had new federal resources and policies in place that would support that kind of expansion. But I also would like to see and think that in my ideal vision of 10 years down the road, the community development finance institutions have begun to invest differently in affordable housing, not just affordability for what I call term limited periods of time, but again, lasting affordability over a time frame that can benefit multiple families. And then also at the local level, I would hope by then we would start to see some progress in, again, achieving the kind of racial equity impact, really identifying geographies where the population is at least, I would say, 40% people of color, to make sure that they are actually benefiting from increased housing investments. And part of the earlier conversation, I was hoping to weigh in on this as well, because I think it's important to note that that bridge loan that you were referring to was made possible by an appraisal that created a value that you were able to access. And we've seen today that there needs to be a reimagining of how the appraisal industry is approaching valuation, particularly for homes that are owned by families of color. We're seeing discrimination happening in that regard as well, where their homes are valued less just because a person of color is known to own the home. And so really, again, this 10-year vision, we should be able to correct some of that within that period of time. We won't do it all. And I know, like you, there are, I would say the number varies depending upon who you talk to, 17 to 18 million Americans who are cost burdened by the cost of their housing. I'm saying to our folks, our million homes is our contribution towards making progress towards solving that problem for those Americans who are in need. And so I think everyone who is working at the national scale needs to be determining what is their contribution towards solving the problem, which is an ongoing housing crisis in this country.
Thank you, Tony. I want to follow up with one quick question. So within the realm of shared equity home ownership, do you see that there's place in the space for Habitat's version of shared equity alongside land trust and permanent affordability, or do you see all of us, would your recommendation be for all of us to move toward permanent affordability?
No, I think there's room for everybody's version to coexist. I count it all to the good. And as I said earlier, a number of Habitat affiliates are participants within our network, and we're actually partnering actively right now with NeighborWorks America, who is providing new resources to actually integrate some version of shared equity into existing housing, nonprofit housing programs across the country, and those vary from CDCs to resident-owned communities to limited equity co-ops.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The Secretary Cisneros, what's in your crystal ball?
Well, I'm happy to look through the same crystal ball as Tony, because it's such a beautiful vision that one sees there, and I think one that is achievable with the right kind of coordination and priority setting. But it all revolves around the scale of affordability efforts, and certainly shared equity is one approach. There are probably another half dozen things that we ought to be doing along those lines. But my hope would be that in 10 years, the scale of affordable housing production and availability would match the changing demographics of the country, which we know are changing very rapidly, so that we could create the ramp for persons of color, families of color who are presently marginalized, to rise toward the middle class, to reinstate the American middle class as we did in the years after World War II, when through the GI Bill and through FHA programs and through educational programs, we were able to create an American middle class that became the backbone, the spine of American prosperity through the rest of the 20th century. If we can, through housing, make it possible once again for people to have that platform I was discussing earlier, and to begin to put together the kind of resources that define them as middle class. Today in America, African Americans and Latinos make less than 70%. Last I looked, it was about 68% in income what white families do. 68% on the average of what white families have. That's income, what comes in, what goes out. In terms of wealth or net worth, that number is about 10% for African Americans and 14% for Latino families, what white families have. And as I said before, the first step, the first vehicle toward creating equitability in access to resources, to wealth, is housing. It's the largest investment that people make. It's the one that, as you described your father, you can act upon later to send someone to college, to create a small business, to create a gift for housing for the next generation. It is fundamental to the American way. Home ownership, entry-level home ownership, affordable home ownership, essential to the American way as we know it. And that's what I would hope we can put ourselves back on the path to where we all understand that basic reality and do something about it.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of consensus here. We do have a question for the audience that actually dovetails nicely with this conversation. And the question is, what data are needed to make and gather support for housing policy that actively works to desegregate neighborhoods, both racially and economically? And I'll throw that out there for either of you to take.
I'll take a stab at it. One thing that we've identified and we're already pursuing is in terms of when folks are using inclusionary zoning, you'd be surprised. There is very little data as to what the impact of inclusionary zoning has been for communities of color. We know that it creates affordable housing units by requiring the private sector to develop some portion of their new construction units as affordable to certain income levels, but we don't have a lot of data on who those units are actually serving in terms of race. So we really need to understand that in order to make sure that it's being effective. And if not, there are things that we've seen that allow it to be more impactful in terms of race. It's controversial, but at times we've seen implementation of preference policies for folks who have been displaced from a particular neighborhood over a particular period of time, having a priority in terms of gaining access to those new construction units that are created in those same neighborhoods. So it can be done.
Thank you.
I'm a big fan, and in fact serve on the board now, of the Urban Institute. It is an organization created by President Johnson back in 1968 to match on the domestic side and support with scientific research and data the advent of the Great Society programs, in the same way that they had a data-oriented organization in the RAND Institution to support national security and foreign policy data requirements in that period. It has become very robust, and they do a really good job of applying science and rationality and data to urban issues. And I would say what they do, as well as others, there are many other think tanks around the country and in Washington and university centers and other places where we can make more sophisticated the kind of data needed to make social policy decisions of this nature. And we need to encourage that, support that research. I was fascinated to see just last week, I got a report from the Urban Institute where they're looking at going beyond the data to look at the way the categorization of data and the counting actually skews some issues in racial ways negatively. In other words, undercounts and underestimates. And so the continued efforts to advance, to modernize, to target the data process so we can use it to make policy is a very worthwhile part of this endeavor.
Thanks. Well, so we're nearing the top of the hour. I wanted to give each of you about 30 seconds for some final thoughts, final words. Tony?
I'd just say part of this sort of future visioning needs to involve fintech. It is changing the way housing is being approached, especially from a homeownership perspective, being able to do that all virtually now, as we've seen it happen during the pandemic. And the products that are being created in terms of mortgages are being produced and marketed and implemented in that manner as well. So I would say that's also something that needs to be looked at from a very broad perspective, but also using that racial equity lens as well.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, final words?
Just to say that I'm a big supporter of Habitat. I had the privilege of serving on the Habitat board. I see the work internationally, but as an American, I just implore Habitat, its affiliates, its volunteers, its staff to take that early vision, which was religious and spiritually based, and apply it to our times and step up the effort, become a greater force, and really be a player. Habitat's already counted among the most productive home builders in the United States. It ranks up there with the largest home builders in terms of number of units per year, but we need to do more. We're falling behind in this arena as a country, not making the kind of progress we should. We do not know yet what the effects of the pandemic will be, but they're likely to be serious and severe and hurt people. So it's time to step up our efforts, and congratulations to Habitat for being willing to consider such a thing.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much for your kind words and your time. I want to thank the Secretary Cisneros again, not only for your lifetime of work, but also for your digging in and being part of the campaign as a member of the cabinet. And Tony, thank you so much for your partnership. I want to give a quick shout out to Emily Faden, who sits on the Public Policy Solutions Task Force from Grounded Solutions, brilliant thinker, reflective of an organization that is just doing amazing work. So thank you for all that you do for housing in the country. Also want to thank everybody who joined us today on the webinar. For anyone interested in learning more about Habitat's Cost of Home campaign, you can visit habitat.org/cost of home. That's habitat.org cost of home, and find out all the information that you desire. It's a great website. Thanks again. Everybody have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan, for leading us through this process.
My pleasure.
Wow.